flowers on the table were my idea. That's the thing nobody mentions. I spent 3 weeks coordinating centerpieces, seating charts, the playlist, the cake tasting. My sister didn't ask me to. I just did it because that's what I always did. I made things beautiful for people who never once thought to say thank you. The wedding was in October, late October, so the leaves outside the venue were doing that thing where they catch the light and look almost golden, almost worth it. I remember thinking that as I stood near the back in a dress my mother had picked, because she said my first choice made me look too put together for a guest. I didn't argue. I never argued. My name is Adeline, Addie to people who actually know me, which, as it turns out, is fewer people than I thought. My sister's name is Cecily. She's 2 years younger than me, which somehow always felt like a crime she was being rewarded for. She married a man named Bryce, who I've always found slightly too loud in restaurants, but my mother adores him, so. The seating chart, the one I spent 11 days revising, placed me at table 9. Table 9 was near the kitchen. Near the kitchen means you hear the clatter of dishes being stacked, the low shout of the catering staff, the constant swing of a heavy door. Table 9 had a wobbly leg that someone had tried to fix with a folded paper napkin. I know because I was the one sitting closest to it, feeling it shift every time the woman across from me reached for the bread basket. I didn't know any of the other people at my table. One was a co-worker of Bryce's I'd never met. 2 were, I think, distant relatives from his side. There was an older woman who introduced herself as the venue coordinator and then seemed confused about why she was seated with guests. We smiled at each other a lot. We didn't have much else. The head table, the long one with the good lighting and the full view of the room, had my parents at it. My mother, in a blush gown she'd been fussing over since February. My father, who gave a toast that made everyone cry, including me, though I was crying for a different reason than I think he intended. My grandmother was there too, my aunt from Phoenix. My cousin Renata, who I grew up sharing a bedroom with every summer until I was 14. None of them saved me a seat. When I asked my mother about it 2 weeks before the wedding, she had said, and I am quoting her exactly because I've replayed this in my head approximately 400 times, "Addie, there just isn't room at the main table. You understand. You're so good at that understanding." I said I understood. I did not understand. What I did instead was go home to my apartment, sit on the kitchen floor with a glass of wine I'd poured and forgotten to drink, and stare at the refrigerator for a long time. On the refrigerator there was a magnet from a vacation I'd taken by myself 2 years earlier, a long weekend in Vermont that no one had been available to join me on. It said, "Breathe. You're exactly where you need to be." I had bought it as a joke. It had started to feel like a threat. The thing about my family is that they are not cruel in ways that are easy to explain. Nobody hits anyone. Nobody screams. There are no dramatic scenes in the driveway. No slammed doors that rattle the windows. My mother is charming at parties. My father volunteers at the food bank twice a month. My sister sends Christmas cards with photos of herself and Bryce looking windswept on some beach, and she always writes something handwritten inside, something like "so grateful for you" in a loopy script that slopes upward. What they do instead is small, the kind of small that you can't point to without sounding unhinged. The way my mother would tell a story about my sister's promotion at dinner, and then, when my father asked how my job was going, she'd say, "Oh, you know, Addie, she's always figuring things out." Not quite a dismissal, not quite anything. The way my sister borrowed $11,000 from me in 2021 when she and Bryce were between jobs and the rent was due, and the way she has never once, in 3 years, mentioned it again. Not the amount. Not the month she'd pay it back. Not even an acknowledgement that it happened. I had dipped into savings I'd spent 4 years building, and it had dissolved into a silence so complete I sometimes wondered if I'd imagined it. The way at every family gathering there was always a moment where a photo was taken. A good photo, one that would end up framed or posted or sent to relatives, and I was never quite in it. Sometimes I was the one taking it. Sometimes I had simply stepped away for something and returned to find them already posed, already smiling, already finished. We got one. It was spontaneous, come see. I was always invited to look at the photo. I was never in it. The wedding was October 14th. I drove myself, parked 3 blocks away because the lot was full, walked in my heels on pavement that was still damp from rain the night before. I had a small gift. A custom piece I'd commissioned from a ceramics artist my sister had mentioned once, offhand, at brunch, saying she loved her work. I had tracked down the artist, waited 6 weeks for the piece to be made, paid more than I should have. I carried it inside in a white box with a ribbon my mother would have approved of. The ceremony was beautiful. I'll give them that. The light through the venue windows was soft, and the officiant said something about love being a choice you make every morning. And I thought about the 2 years I'd spent in a relationship that ended because I kept choosing someone who had stopped choosing me back. I thought about how I'd handled that alone too. Packed my own boxes, signed my own lease on the new apartment, figured things out. When the reception started and I found table 9, I set my purse down and straightened the wobbly leg with a cocktail napkin and decided I was going to be fine. I was not, as it turned out, entirely fine. The toast from my father was the part that got me. He talked about watching Cecily grow up, her determination, her warmth, the way she'd always known what she wanted. He talked about Bryce like he'd known him for years, because by that point he had. Family dinners and holidays, and the slow absorption of a stranger into the centre of everything. He talked about their future together, the home they'd build, the life ahead. He didn't mention me once, not by name, not in passing. I was the one who had flown home when my father had his cardiac scare 2 years ago. I had taken 2 weeks of unpaid leave, managed his medications, driven him to appointments, coordinated with the cardiologist when my mother was too overwhelmed to ask the right questions. I had made spreadsheets. I have, apparently, a talent for spreadsheets. Cecily sent flowers and FaceTimed once from a work trip she couldn't leave. My father's toast lasted 4.5 minutes. I counted. After, I smiled when Cecily came by the table, briefly, in her dress. Luminous, in the way brides are luminous. And she squeezed my hand and said, "I'm so glad you're here," and I believed her. That's the thing. I believed her. She meant it, and somehow that made it worse because it meant the absence wasn't malice. It was just default. I was the default absence. The one you're glad is there without noticing she almost isn't. I left at 8:30. I told the venue coordinator at my table that I had an early morning, which was true. I said goodbye to no one at the head table because they were taking photos again, the golden lit ones with the sparklers, and I didn't want to interrupt. I drove home. I changed out of my dress. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop because I couldn't sleep and I needed something to do with my hands. What I ended up doing was opening a folder I hadn't looked at in 6 months. The folder was labelled, very practically, property. Inside it, 12 documents, a spreadsheet that I had built carefully over 2 years, some wire transfer confirmations, a few PDF appraisals. Here is what my family did not know about me. When I was 26, I'd taken a job at a commercial real estate firm that no one in my family had fully understood. My mother had once described it to her friends as, "Addie works in offices, I think." The job had not been glamorous. It's been 70-hour weeks, and learning to read leases and understanding cap rates, and making myself useful to people who were initially skeptical that someone who looked like me could be useful. I had been useful. Aggressively useful. I had also been quietly saving since my first paycheck in a way that had become something of an obsession after the loan to my sister. Not out of resentment, exactly, but out of a recognition that I could not count on a safety net, so I had to build one myself. By the time of the wedding, I was 31. By the time of the wedding, I had, through a combination of savings and a small inheritance from my maternal grandmother, the real grandmother, the one who died when I was 22 and who I think actually saw me, purchased 2 rental properties in the Nashville area and 1 studio unit in a building in Asheville that had since appreciated considerably. The total value of the portfolio at the last appraisal was somewhere north of $1.4 million. I also had in a separate account that I'd opened specifically because it made sense to keep things partitioned, a cash and investment balance that I'd built through years of methodical, boring, consistent effort. Index funds, high-yield savings, a modest amount of individual stock that I'd gotten lucky with and then diversified out of before I could get unlucky. That account had crossed the $800,000 mark in September. I had not told my family any of this. It was not a dramatic decision. There was no moment where I looked in a mirror and said I will keep this from them as revenge. It was quieter than that. It was just, I had learned over many years that the things I shared with my family had a way of being absorbed into the family without belonging to me anymore. My ideas became suggestions. My efforts became expectations. My money became available. The $11,000 had taught me something I didn't fully understand until later. That in my family, what I had was communal, and what I needed was my own problem. So I had kept the properties to myself. When my mother asked about my apartment, I talked about my apartment. When my father asked about work, I talked about my job. When my sister asked if I was dating anyone, I talked about the guy I'd gone on 3 dates with in the spring. Nobody asked about the properties. Nobody asked about the accounts. It had genuinely never occurred to them that there was anything to ask about. The week after the wedding, I got a text from my mother. The text said, "Cecily mentioned she and Bryce are thinking about buying a house. They're struggling with the down payment. I know you always have a little saved up. Could be a nice wedding gift from you." I read it 3 times. Then I put my phone face down on the counter and went for a very long walk. The ask was framed like a thought, like something that had just occurred to her, like a little saved up was the natural way to describe whatever she imagined I had. I thought about the paperwork I'd signed for the Asheville unit, the property management calls I took on Saturday mornings, the years of eating lunch at my desk and not buying the thing I wanted and making the boring choice again and again. A little saved up. I came home from my walk and I made tea and I sat with it for a long time. Then I typed back, "I'll think about it." I didn't send that. I deleted it. I typed, "That's really something for them to work toward together." I sent that one. My mother didn't respond for 2 days. When she did, it was a single word. Fine. I knew what that meant. I knew the temperature that word carried in her hands. What happened next was not something I planned. It was more like a series of things I'd already been thinking about that suddenly had an order to them. I called my attorney. I had an attorney now, which still felt strange to say, and we talked through some things I'd been considering about the Asheville property. I called my property manager about a lease that was ending on one of the Nashville units. I called my financial advisor, a woman I trusted enormously, who had been gently suggesting for about a year that I think about what I actually wanted my life to look like. "What do you actually want?" she had asked in her very calm, very serious way. I had not had a good answer. I had been so occupied with building the floor that I hadn't thought much about the ceiling. But after the wedding, after the text, after the single cold word, "fine," I started to have an answer. What I wanted was a life that was mine in a way my life had never quite been. I had already been looking, in an idle way, at properties in a different state. I had a preference for somewhere with water, not necessarily the ocean, though I wasn't opposed, but water in the way you can hear it and feel it and have it be the thing you wake up to. I had looked at things in coastal Georgia. I had looked at things in the coastal Georgia. I had looked at things in the low country of South Carolina. I had opened and closed the same real estate listing tabs late at night more times than I could count. In December, 2 months after the wedding, I made an offer. I did not tell anyone. The house was in Beaufort, South Carolina. It was not large. It was not the kind of thing that photographs well for a magazine. All straight lines and curated furniture. It was older, with a porch that faced the water and a kitchen that needed updating and a garden that had been left to its own devices for a while. The price was fair. The bones were good. My inspector spent 2.5 hours in it and came out looking satisfied, which I'd learned to take as the best possible sign. I closed on it the week before Christmas. The holidays that year were at my parents' house. Same as always. My mother makes a brisket and my father makes mulled wine, and the decorations are the same ones from my childhood, including an ornament I made in 3rd grade that she has always hung near the back of the tree. I noticed where she hung it. I always noticed. I went. Of course I went. I sat in the living room and I listened to my father and Bryce talk about sports, and I helped my mother set the table and I held it together through dinner. And at some point my mother started talking about Cecily and Bryce's house search and how difficult the market was. And she said, in the way she says things, as though the air in the room has already agreed with her. It would be such a help if family could step up. She did not look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. Cecily looked at her plate. Bryce talked about interest rates. I excused myself to use the bathroom. I stood in the hallway for a moment, outside the door at grown-up walking past, and I looked at the photos on the wall. There were a lot of photos. Cecily at her college graduation. Bryce being welcomed into the family at some event I didn't remember. A family portrait from about 6 years ago where everyone is in white shirts on a beach. I am in that photo. I'm at the edge, turned slightly, like I'd been mid-turn when the shutter clicked. Like I'd been about to leave, or about to arrive and the camera hadn't been able to decide which. I went back to the table. I finished my dinner. I helped clear the plates. I drove home that night and I walked into my apartment and I stood in the centre of it and I thought, in 2 months, I am going to be somewhere else entirely. I had already started packing in small ways. Not dramatically. Just the things on the bookshelves I actually cared about, the kitchen things that were truly mine, the art I picked out over the years that reflected something about who I actually was. I packed them slowly, a box at a time, in the evenings when I had nothing else going on. My lease was up in February. I had let it run out, which my landlord took to mean I was renewing. I let him think that until I was ready. In January, I put in my notice at work. My manager was surprised, not upset. There was a conversation about whether I'd reconsider, whether there was something that would change my mind, but surprised, I said I was pursuing something else. I said it with the confidence of someone who actually had something else. Which I did, which was still a slightly new feeling. I told my parents I was taking a new position in another city. I said it was a good opportunity. My mother asked which city and I said I was still working out the details. My father said, "Good for you, kiddo," and that was more than I had expected and less than I had needed. My sister texted, "That's exciting. Where?" I wrote back, still sorting it out. She sent a heart emoji. She didn't ask again. In February, I left. I packed the rest of my things on a Thursday. I had hired movers who were professional and efficient and who I tipped generously because they did good work. And I had the money to be generous, and I had decided quietly that I was going to live like someone who knew what she had. I drove south with a thermos of coffee and a playlist I'd been building for months. It took about 9 hours. I stopped once in Georgia for gas and a sandwich, and stood in the parking lot for a moment in the January air. Cold, but not Nashville cold, and stretched my back and thought about nothing in particular. When I pulled up to the house in Beaufort, it was almost evening. The light was doing what light does near water, that low, amber, everything is okay kind of light that doesn't happen inland, or at least doesn't happen the same way. The porch was exactly how I remembered it. The garden was still going its own way. A heron was standing, improbably, in the marsh at the edge of the property, and it looked at me with the particular dignity of herons everywhere, which is to say, unbothered. I unlocked the door. I stood in the entry for a moment in a house that was mine in a way nothing had ever quite been mine. Then I went and found the kettle I packed and made tea, because some things don't change, and the house was quiet, and the water was outside, and that was enough. My mother called in March, 3 weeks after I'd sent her the new address. She called because she wanted to know when I was coming home for Easter. I told her I wasn't sure I could make it. The drive was long, I was still getting settled. There was a pause. Then she said carefully, "Your sister mentioned you bought a house." "I did," I said. "You didn't tell us." "I know." Another pause. Longer. "How?" she started, and then didn't finish the sentence. "How did you afford it? How did you manage this? Who are you?" The question underneath all the other questions, the one she didn't know how to ask and maybe didn't want the answer to. "I'd been saving for a while," I said. She made a sound I didn't have a word for. It wasn't hurt, exactly. It was something more like recalibration. I didn't apologize. I had apologized for things that weren't my fault for most of my life, and I was trying, slowly, to stop. "It's a good house," I said. "You'd like the porch." She said she'd have to see it sometime. She said it like she was extending an invitation to herself. like she was doing me a favour by suggesting she might come. I said that would be nice. After we hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time. The heron was back, or maybe a different heron, I couldn't tell, standing in the same spot in the marsh, looking at the same middle distance. The $11,000 my sister borrowed was still out there, unreturned, unacknowledged. The wedding gift I'd carried in its white box with the careful ribbon had been texted about once. Love it, so thoughtful, and never mentioned again. The weeks of centerpiece coordination and seating charts absorbed into the event and forgotten. I thought about all of that, and then I thought about the porch, the lights, the kettle I'd found in a box and unpacked first because some things are priorities. I thought about the woman at the property management company who called me Ms. Whitmore in a way that had initially felt strange and now felt like a fact. I thought about what my financial advisor had asked me, what do you actually want? The heron drifted off the marsh without warning, one long, unhurried extension of wings, and moved across the water and disappeared. I thought I finally had something like an answer,